Look, I get no one likes to be called racist. But sometimes there's just no other way to describe the use of bigoted tropes that for generations have threatened black lives.
Here we go again with the theater. Let's get down to the facts.
Given that no scientific studies have shown significant numbers of reinfections of patients previously infected or previously vaccinated, what specific studies do you cite to argue that the public should be wearing masks well into 2022?
I'm not sure I understand the connection of what you're saying about masks and reinfection. We're talking about people who have never been infected before.
You're telling everybody to wear a mask, whether they've had an infection or a vaccine. What I'm saying is they have immunity, and everybody agrees they have immunity. What studies do you have that people that have had the vaccine or have had the infection are spreading the infection? If we're not spreading the infection, isn't it just theater?
No, it's
not.
not.
A vaccine and you're wearing 2 masks. Isn't that theater?
No, that's not. Here we go again with the theater. Let's get down to the facts. Okay, the studies that you quote from Crotty and Sete look at in vitro examination of memory immunity, which in their paper they specifically say this does not necessarily pertain to the actual protection. It's in vitro.
And what studies can you point to that show significant reinfection? There are no studies that show significant reinfection.
Let me finish the response to your question, if you please. The other thing is that when you talk about reinfection and you don't keep in the concept of variants, that's an entirely different ballgame. That's a good reason for a mask. In the South African study conducted by J&J, they found that people who were infected with wild type and were exposed to the variant in South Africa, the 351, it was as if they had never been infected before. They had no protection. So when you talk about reinfection, you've got to make sure you're talking about wild type. I agree with you that you very likely would have protection from wild type for at least 6 months if you're infected. But we in our country now have variants that are circulating.
Significant reinfection. What study shows significant reinfection, hospitalization, and death after either natural infection or the vaccine? It doesn't exist. There is no evidence that there are significant reinfections after vaccine. In fact, I don't think we have a hospitalization in the United States after the 2-week period after the second vaccination. We don't have a death in the United States.
You're not hearing what I'm saying about variants. We're talking about wild type versus variants.
And what proof is there that there are significant reinfections with hospitalizations and death from the variants? None in our country. Zero.
Well, because we don't have a prevalent of a variant yet. We're having one. Can I finish? We're having 117 that's becoming more dominant.
Your policy based on conjecture.
No,
it
isn't based on conjecture.
Variants, so you want people to wear a mask for another couple years.
No.
You've been vaccinated and you parade around in 2 masks for show.
No.
You can't get it again. There's virtually 0% chance you're going to get it, and yet you're telling people that have had the vaccine, who have immunity. You're defying everything we know about immunity by telling people to wear a mask who've been vaccinated.
No.
Instead, you should be saying there is no science to say we're going to have a problem from the large number of people being vaccinated. You want to get rid of vaccine hesitancy? Tell them they can quit wearing their mask after they get the vaccine. You want people to get the vaccine? Give them a reward instead of telling them that the nanny state's going to be there for 3 more years and you got to wear a mask forever. People don't want to hear it. There's no science behind it.
Well, let me just state for the record that masks are not theater. Masks are protective. And we
have immunity there, theater. If you already have immunity, you're wearing a mask to give comfort to others. You're not wearing a mask because of any science.
I totally disagree with you.
These lies casting Black Lives Matter as violent have already done real damage. One of our colleagues said last week about the events of January 6th was felt by many to be racist and hurtful, a stain on the office he is so fortunate to hold. Look, I get no one likes to be called racist. But sometimes there's just no other way to describe the use of bigoted tropes that for generations have threatened black lives by stoking white fear of African Americans and black men in particular. On a radio show, our colleague explained that he never feared for his safety during the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. But make no mistake, under different circumstances, he would have been afraid.
Had the tables been turned and President Trump won the election, and those were tens of thousands of Black Lives Matter and Antifa protesters, I might have been a little concerned.
Is that not racism, Mr. President? And I don't think the senator is ignorant of the fact that for centuries in this country, white supremacy has thrived on using fear to justify oppression, discrimination, and violence against people of color. I do, however, think my colleague may be ignorant of the pain caused by his comments and unaware of how they compound the trauma that so many still feel in the wake of the events of January 6th. And because I do not think I can do justice to that pain, I want to share with you an email I received this weekend. It's from one of the most devoted public servants I have ever had the pleasure of working with, an African American member of my staff. I would not normally send you an email like this, but I am at a loss of how to express the outrage and hurt I am feeling by the comments made by Senator Johnson that he would have been more afraid on January 6th if the insurrectionists would have been from Black Lives Matter. I am blessed to be a member on your staff and have had the opportunity to serve as a staff member in the New Jersey delegation for 34 years, but this is the most painful thing I have ever heard being said by a U.S. Senator. I could not imagine that the horrible and painful events from January 6th could be replicated in a statement from a sitting member of the Senate. These comments is worse than the image of the insurrectionist walking through the Capitol building with a Confederate flag. He is perpetrating the racist trope that the country should fear black people. I have experienced what it's like to have a taxi cab pass you by in order to pick up white passengers who are further down the block of where you're standing. Nothing can describe the feeling when you have entered a store and having store clerks watch your every step while shopping. Sandy, that's his wife, and I have had conversations with our sons when they were young about how to enter a store, not look suspicious, keep your hands out of your pockets until you make your purchase, or how to respond and talk to police officers in any interaction. I've had the difficult conversation of explaining to a young black scouter in our scout troop why a white campground store clerk accused him of not paying for an item because he was black. This type of hate speech is not new. The hardest part of what he said is that in 2021, a United States Senator would so freely express this type of hate out loud. I'm so grateful for our officers who endured so many injuries on January 6th, and I pray that they will recover physically and mentally. They are going through so much right now. I feel guilty that my email to you might sound shallow because of the pain that they are trying to overcome. I understand the Senate works best when both sides can find common ground. But how do you really reach common ground when such views can be held? Again, I'm sorry for reaching out late on Saturday evening, but I needed to share this with you. Keith. Mr. President, to read these pained words both broke my heart and boiled my blood. Thousands of people of color serve in the United States Capitol workforce. There are legislative staffers like Keith and Capitol police officers and maintenance workers, cafeteria staff, and so much more. I should not have to stand here and remind anyone that many of them feared for their lives on January 6th. But not Senator Johnson. He felt no fear.
I knew those are people that love this country, that truly respect law enforcement, would never do anything to break a law, and so I wasn't concerned.
Mr. President, people who love this country do not desecrate our most sacred democratic institutions and display symbols of racial hatred like the Confederate flag in the halls of Congress. People who respect law enforcement do not assault Capitol police officers, beat them within inches of their death, and hurl ugly epithets like officers of color. People who would never do anything to break the law, would not try to overturn the rule of law, plot to kill elected officials, and stop the peaceful transfer of powers instructed by the Constitution of the United States. Now, I know what some right-wing media pundits and some of my Republican colleagues will say. They say it every time that they are asked to accept some responsibility for perpetuating the lies told by President Trump that inspired the violent events of January 6th. They say, what about Black Lives Matter? They say, well, what about it? Well, I say, well, what about it? The violent picture they paint of this movement could not be more divorced from reality. At this point, several reputable studies have confirmed that the protests launched in the wake of George Floyd's chilling murder were overwhelmingly peaceful. I repeat, the Black Lives Matter movement is overwhelmingly peaceful. I know many people don't care about facts these days, but it is the truth. One study out of Harvard University analyzed 7,305 Black Lives Matter protests. The conclusion? Allow me to quote Professor Erica Chenoweth. She said, quote, only 3.7% of the protests involved property damage or some form of vandalism. Some portion of these involved neither police nor protesters, but people engaging in vandalism or looting alongside the protests. In short, our data suggests that 96.3% of events involved no property damage or police injuries, and in 97.7% of events, no injuries were reported among participants, bystanders, or police. Likewise, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, an organization I might add is partially funded by the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, examines 7,750 different Black Lives Matter demonstrations across the nation last summer. They found just 3% of those protests associated with any violence or property destruction whatsoever. They also concluded that police departments, quote, disproportionately use force while intervening in demonstrations associated with the Black Lives Matter movement relative to other types of demonstrations. Indeed, on January 6th, as we waited for hours for backup from the National Guard and other law enforcement agencies to come to the aid of Congress, I know that I'm not the only one who could not help but think of the violent government-sanctioned crackdowns that met Black Lives Matter's protests last summer. The bottom line is that these lies casting Black Lives Matter as violent have already done real damage. They have convinced millions of Americans that they should fear those who march under the banner of this movement for justice, when really it is the resurgence of violent white supremacy that should be Americans' real cause for alarm. Indeed, last October, the Department of Homeland Security issued a report confirming that white supremacists pose the most lethal domestic terror threat to the American people. And research from the Center for Strategic and International Studies finds that white supremacists and their sympathizers carried out 2/3 of terrorist plots and attacks in 2020. In the weeks since January 6th, we have learned that far-right extremist groups that regularly preach white supremacy, such as the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, played a major role in plotting and executing the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Everybody in this body should know that when you perpetuate such racist tropes, you contribute to a culture that gives people permission to treat Black Americans as suspicious and their lives as expendable. We in the United States Senate are supposed to hold ourselves to a higher standard. We're supposed to advance America's long march towards a more perfect union, not coddle and cater to those who would take us backwards. And we are supposed to stand up for the truth. And that's what brought me to the floor today.
And yesterday was a really bad day for him, and this is what he did.
We're making someone who committed these murders already a victim by saying he's having a bad day.
This is still early, but he does claim that it was not racially motivated. He apparently has an issue, what he considers a sex addiction, and sees these locations as something that allows him to go to these places, and it's a temptation for him that he wanted to eliminate. And he was pretty much fed up and kind of at the end of his rope, and yesterday was a really bad day for him, and this is what he did.
This was not a random, indiscriminate crime. This man got in his car and he went to these locations to target Asian women. And I think it was irresponsible for law enforcement to kind of put into public consumption today the idea that this guy has a sex addiction and he had a bad day. I think that dehumanizes our victims, and it makes it problematic for a prosecution later on if a jury pool thinks, you know what, these were just sex workers. We haven't heard that either.
He claims that it was not racially motivated, that this was based on some sex addiction, but I'm taking that with a grain of salt. This is a man who murdered 8 people in cold blood, so it's very difficult to believe what he says.
I think this moment is about, the ongoing and history of hypersexualization and sexual violence against Asian women, right? In that, alongside the hypersexualization and sexual violence is the invisibilization of our stories and our lives. This dates all the way back from the racial and colonial wars that our communities have experienced in Vietnam, in the Philippines, in Cambodia, in Korea. The sexual violence we experienced overseas, abroad, is carried over here. And the way that that takes place, or that can actually happen, is if you don't see us as human, if you see us as only as objects for your sexual issues, I think that's what they called it, right? Or his sexual addiction, right? You can only get away with that if you see us as non-human.
Racially motivated violence must be called out for exactly what it is. And we must stop making excuses or rebranding it as economic anxiety or sexual addiction. As a woman who is Black and Korean, I'm acutely aware of how it feels to be erased or ignored, and how the default position when violence is committed against people of color or women is to defer from confronting the hate that is often the motivation. Words matter.
Why is temptation in the form of an Asian woman? Why then would you go to an Asian massage parlor, 3 of them, to target them? If this were a synagogue, say, or a Black church, would people have the same impression that clearly there's no connection to race? When 7 of the 8 people who are killed are Asian, and 6 of them are women.
There are plenty of places where you can go to get massages or strip clubs or whatever that don't involve Asian women. In the Atlanta area. Plenty of opportunities. So the fact that he picked those places says something about his psyche and what his motivations were, even if he's not saying it out loud to investigators.
And as a police officer, you're asking me to someday put handcuffs on these people that are heroes in my life and arrest the people that saved my daughter? Please don't ask me to do that.
The spring sports season brought a promise of normalcy. This body seeks to take that away from her. Why? Because my daughter happens to be transgender.
I am a police sergeant with the city of Gadsden. I've been there 27 years now. I've taken the day off to come here today. And with all that I've done in my career, you'd think I wouldn't be scared by a whole lot, but right now I'm standing here just a little bit terrified. I am the father of a transgender daughter. My daughter came out to me when she was 16 years old. So when I found a note sitting there in front of my computer, and I started to read it, I realized this is a coming out letter. And as I read more, I found it was a coming out as a transgender child. But I was a police investigator for a long time, so I put myself to the grindstone and started investigating. Unfortunately, the first thing I found was half the kids, their teens that are transgender, try to kill themselves. I was terrified. A little more looking, I found out that number drops to just below normal kids their age if they've got cooperation from their family, health care, and therapists, and people in the community that can help them. They are angels to me. And as a police officer, you're asking me to someday put handcuffs on these people that are heroes in my life and arrest the people that saved my daughter? Please don't ask me to do that.
I am the mom of a student athlete. The spring sports season brought a promise of normalcy, a glimmer of hope, an opportunity to socialize and exercise safely. This body seeks to take that away from her. Why? Because my daughter happens to be transgender. It's not dangerous for my daughter to be on the same sports team as her girlfriends. She's not taking the spot of another, more deserving girl, as if my daughter deserves less than. She's not a threat. Rather, she's a teenager that has worked for the last decade trying to help people understand who she really is. Her teammates have been her friends since preschool. Pulling her from this team of her cherished community and sending her to play with the boys would be nothing short of traumatic and cruel. I can tell you with absolute certainty that the boys' team would not be safe for many reasons, the least of which is that her petite size would be overpowered by the boys on her team, and aside from her physical safety, she would undoubtedly be heckled by players, and dare I say parents, on the sidelines, wondering what a girl is doing competing against their sons. So I'm left wondering, if she doesn't belong on the boys' team, and she doesn't belong on the girls' team, where exactly do you think she belongs? Can you tell me she belongs somewhere? Or do you think she doesn't belong anywhere? Because that is what passing this bill will tell her.
If you don't take the shot that Joe Biden wants you to take, then Joe Biden is going to have to shut the country down again. The administration would like you to take this vaccine. Joe Biden told you last week, if you don't, you can't celebrate the 4th of July. No socially distanced barbecues for you, buddy. You're going to have to eat your hot dogs alone inside. What if you don't want to get vaccinated? Not everyone does. It's arriving in small bottles, but with a glitzy entrance. Have a vaccine and a smile. Just do it. How are the rest of us supposed to respond to a marketing campaign like this? Well, nervously. Whatever you do, don't say this is social control. Because if you do, the richest and most powerful people in the world will act in perfect coordination to shut you down immediately. It all seems a bit much. It feels false.
He tried to take credit for everything that Donald Trump did on COVID-19.
How effective is this coronavirus vaccine? How necessary is it to take the vaccine? Don't dismiss those questions from anti-vaxxers.
I'm actually beginning to have doubts. I've been telling my friends I'm going to get the vaccine. Half of them agree, and the other half think I'm absolutely nuts.
And then there's this, something a guest said on Laura Ingram's show that was apparently so good, she felt the need to tweet it out afterwards. Quote, "You are becoming guinea pigs in a huge gene experiment conducted on humans." She put that out into the world.
What about this vaccine? Why are Americans being discouraged from asking simple, straightforward questions about it? Questions like, how effective are these drugs? Are they safe?
Those questions were the subject of 2 8-hour-long Zoom meetings publicly televised by the FDA where they went through the data. These are not hidden. And Tucker Carlson knows this, obviously. Tucker knows there are really easily accessible answers to these questions about the vaccines. He's not stupid. He just thinks his audience is.
I would recommend it, and I would recommend it to a lot of people that don't want to get it, and a lot of those people voted for me, frankly.
They looked at the data. They found it to be safe and highly efficacious, about 95%, and even more efficacious against serious disease.
Fox viewers are guinea pigs in a huge disinformation experiment conducted on humans. And Americans, whether they are Fox viewers or not, will pay for it with their health or their livelihoods or their lives, because no price is too high for Fox to right its ratings ship.